Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 5th of December 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by Alex Thompson, delivering Eastern approaches from the Netherlands. Well, the plot thickens, Mike, I think.
Well, we'll just get straight on with Brexit. This was Theresa yesterday. Well, she lost three Brexit-related votes in an hour yesterday evening. After she launched the 5-day debate on her deal. And she's apparently become the first British Prime Minister in 40 years to be defeated 3 times in one day. That's all very good. Well, in fact, she wasn't just defeated because the Theresa May's government, the Theresa May regime perhaps, was found to be in contempt of Parliament. This is the first time in history that that's happened. And this was after they refused to publish the full legal advice concerning the Brexit deal. Well, I suppose, Brian, they thought that they could get away with this because they had, previous governments had refused to publish the legal advice with regard to going to war in Iraq or in Libya, for example. They thought they could get away with it. Well, they didn't in this case. Let's just have a look and see what was said by Andrea Leadsom yesterday. We're starting off with Keir Starmer here.
It is, I think, unprecedented for this House to find government ministers in contempt. The motion makes clear the government must now publish the Attorney-General's final legal advice in full. I hope the government will now confirm and comply with that order. But if the government fails to respond, Mr. Speaker, what steps can I and others take to ensure the government does comply with this motion and before the votes that we have next Tuesday?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've tested the opinion of the House twice on this very serious subject. We've listened carefully, and in light of the expressed will of the House, we will publish the final and full advice provided by the Attorney-General to Cabinet. But recognising the very serious constitutional issues that this raises, I have referred the matter to the Privileges Committee to consider the implications of the humble address.
So she was asked, how long was that going to take? Was that going to be completed by next Tuesday when the vote takes place? And she said, well, in fact, they're going to publish the stuff this morning. And I saw that it was supposed to be published at 11:30 this morning. But if I could welcome Alex Thompson to the programme. Alex, a lot of people suggesting that this is a significant constitutional crisis at this point. This is the first time in history that a government has been found in contempt of Parliament. Where do you see this going in terms of the constitutional side of things, aside from Brexit?
I see it, Mike, going in the direction of Parliament, against its own will perhaps, rediscovering its essential role as the High Court and Grand Jury of the people, particularly the House of Commons. Now, this is hotly denied. Of course, the Labour MP who claims to be the constitutional expert, equivalent to Jacob Rees-Mogg on the Conservative side, is Chris Bryant. And when I still had a Twitter account before I decided to get rid of that, I did explain, I did challenge Chris Bryant and say, do you accept the classic position that Parliament is a high court? And he said in a single word tweet, no. But that has been the constitutional position. There's a guest whose name eludes me right now, who was talking about the lately deceased George H.W. Bush, talking on a live stream last night on Jason Goodman's channel on YouTube, who goes into this very point because, of course, the US Congress is supposed to be based on the mother of parliaments and to preserve its best aspects. And this guest says specifically that in the process of impeachment of President Trump, which the Democrats are aiming to do after the midterm gains, they treat Congress as the lower house, equivalent to the House of Commons, of course, as the High Court and Grand Jury of the people, And the upper house, the revising chamber with the constitutional expertise, is the guardians of the people who have the expertise, which of course is the Lords, not acting willy-nilly, but saying, okay, the people through their representatives want this to happen. Now let's see how we can arrange this. Now, the third aspect of Parliament, the one which I think even British viewers might not appreciate, is that the Crown sits in Parliament. And what you've just seen is Andrea Leadsom speaking on behalf of the Crown. Yes, she is an elected member of Parliament, returned for a geographical constituency of the people, but in that clip, she's not just speaking as Tory to Keir Starmer's Labour. She's speaking as it were, with the crown on, in lieu of the Queen, to Parliament. We're often confused by this in common law jurisdictions because it's often wrongly assumed that Parliament is simply MPs as us. The committees is all us. The floor of the House is all us, but Crown ministers sitting on the front bench of the government side is the Crown. And where the Crown is telling the representatives of the people, we defy you, or we're going to elude you and your impeachment and your contempt findings. Of course, nobody can be held in contempt if it's not by a court. So Parliament is by definition a court and a jury. Well, what's happening there is that the Crown is betraying its trust and oath given to the people.
Okay, it went on because, as I say, there were three votes yesterday that were lost by Theresa May, and this is Dominic Grieve. He brought a point of order, or an issue to Parliament, to the Commons rather, because he said that really Parliament needed to have the power to make final Brexit amendments. So if, in other words, if she fails to get her deal approved by the Commons next Tuesday, then MPs would have the right to dictate a plan B to Theresa May. Is that again an expression of this determination suddenly by MPs to be representatives of the people, or in fact are they qualified to be, and would we end up with that plan B being what they want rather than a representation of what the people want? Alex?
On that point, Mike, I would say that the key thing to watch out for is this snake oil that we have to vote as MPs according to our conscience when it comes to matters of critical national importance or morality. We've seen this with abortion bills, where the MPs have defied the majority will in the country not to allow mass abortion on demand. And we have seen it on matters of the European Union and the Constitution. And we've seen it with David Lammy, who in some terms I have to respect, for example, his behaviour over Grenfell Tower, in which he was personally one of the bereaved. But Lammy is a good example, being a barrister, that he has this snake oil which resides in the Bar Association above all, of saying that we parliamentarians have a representative parliamentary democracy and parliamentary sovereignty, and we vote with our conscience. This is all a denial, as I went into in my AV 9.1 talk at the weekend, a denial of fiduciary duty, which is, in other words, the obligation to take orders. Fiduciary duty is a phrase also used in banking and investment management, your own former field, Mike, where, of course, you'll testify to that. You have an absolute obligation to act in the best interests of the client and really only to be a brain at their service. That's the same role that MPs have, and that is where we're going to see the pinch, I think, on all sides now. We could even see Labour MPs crossing the floor in practice or de facto.
If I can just add a little bit to that, Alex, I've heard over the last 48 hours that there's also a separate interest in constitutional matters, which is now impacting on certain lords. And it appears to be that the questioning is now going deeper than just the law and the direct issue of Brexit. It now appears that people are starting to come back to the whole of the process which took us into the European Union in the first place. I haven't got much detail on this yet, but what I've been told over the last 48 hours, 24 hours in particular, is that there are a number of lords who are now very, very keen for documentation and advice on what the true constitutional situation is. It seems to me that people are beginning to get suspicious of the whole of the EU package, as well they might.
Okay, well, look, let's move on to NATO. And, the NATO foreign ministers have been meeting over the last 2 days at NATO headquarters in Brussels. NATO foreign ministers met with the foreign ministers of Georgia and Ukraine yesterday to discuss the security situation in the Black Sea region and the NATO support for those two countries. But before we get on to other issues, let's listen to what Federica Mogherini had to say when she arrived at this foreign ministers meeting, and we'll have a discussion with Alex in a second about the significance of Federica Mogherini even being there. So let's have a listen to this.
Our work with Afghanistan is extremely important, very high on our agenda, and perfectly complementary to the work NATO is doing there. I was just exactly 1 week ago in Geneva at the conference the UN organized to support the peace process in Afghanistan. The European Union is the major donor there, and I have offered to President Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah last week the European Union support to be a guarantor for the peace process, to support its implementation in very practical terms. And we've put on the table also very practical incentives for the Taliban to join the peace process and to engage in laying down the arms. One last word. I know that yesterday here the ministers discussed the INF. For the European Union, it's key to our security. It's a fundamental pillar of our security architecture in Europe, and we want to see this preserved and fully implemented.
So we'll come on to the INF Treaty in a second, but the first thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on here, Alex, is that the EU and Federica Mogherini is the High Representative, effectively the Foreign Minister, but the EU is taking much more of a sort of foreign affairs, foreign ministerial role on these international bodies, and NATO being one of them, and clearly they have defined a foreign policy as far as Afghanistan is concerned, and they're directly involved in the Afghan peace process. So anybody in Britain, any MP or any politician or any media outlet which suggests that the EU isn't looking at becoming some kind of federalised institution, well, they're already well down that road, and that has implications for defence and security as well.
Correct, Mike, and Afghanistan is a very clear-cut example because, of course, previously NATO was the key, as they would call it in those circles, stakeholder through ISAF and the peacekeeping missions going out of NATO bases. Now we have the EU, as in other areas, as David Ellis has pointed out, the EU being the destination which the bus of NATO dropped everyone off at. They both co-reside in Brussels in terms of headquarters. But of course, what gives it away is that Afghanistan is by no stretch of the imagination a neighbour or the near abroad of the EU. They will, of course, argue, well, it's a cauldron of instability which reaches us on the streets of Europe. But then your immigration policy determines that, doesn't it? So don't cry wolf there, as it were, when it's within your power. But when you've got branching out into Afghanistan, this certainly shows what you're saying, Mike, about foreign policy of the member states being suborned here, because the EU has claimed that that Mogherini's functions in her foreign action, it's usually dressed up in terms of action and neighbourhood incentives and so on, partnership. It's all claimed that is to stabilise the EU's neighbourhood, basically the Mediterranean, Levantine and North African basin. But Afghanistan is several countries removed from the furthest state that could ever become a member state of the EU. So here we see the foreign policy of the EU becoming, as you say, supranational and even federalised, and we also see the EU regarding itself more as at that level at least, as shall we say, a Eurasian Union, which has long been one of the power blocks that people have talked about.
Indeed. Well, look, let's look at the INF aspect of this. So NATO did publish a statement on the INF treaty, and this is what they said. Allies have concluded that Russia has developed and fielded a missile system, the 9M729, which violates the INF treaty and poses significant risk to Euro-Atlantic security. We strongly support the finding of the United States that Russia is in material breach of its obligations under the INF treaty. For over 5 years, allies in the United States in particular have repeatedly raised their concerns with the Russian Federation, both bilaterally and multilaterally. As we stated in the Brussels Summit Declaration in July, Russia has responded to our concerns with denials and obfuscation Russia only recently acknowledged the existence of the missile system, but without providing the necessary transparency or explanation. They said the United States has remained in full compliance with its obligations under the INF Treaty since it entered into force. Allies have emphasised that the situation whereby the United States and other parties fully abide by the treaty and Russia does not is not sustainable. Russia's violation of the INF Treaty erodes the foundations of effective arms control and undermines Allied security. This is part of Russia's broader pattern of behaviour that is intended to weaken the overall Euro-Atlantic security architecture. Allies are committed to preserving strategic stability and Euro-Atlantic security. NATO will continue to ensure the credibility and effectiveness of the alliance's overall deterrence and defence posture. We will continue to consult each other regularly with a view to ensuring our collective security. We will continue to keep the fielding of Russian intermediate-range missiles under close review. And they said allies are firmly committed to the preservation of effective international arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation. Therefore, we will continue to uphold, support and further strengthen arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation as a key element of Euro-Atlantic security, taking into account the prevailing security environment. We continue to aspire to a constructive relationship with Russia when Russia's actions make that possible. As most recently confirmed in the Brussels summit, we remain open to dialogue with Russia, including in the NATO-Russia Council. We call on Russia to return urgently to full and verifiable compliance. It's now up to Russia to preserve the INF Treaty. Well, in the meantime, Dmitry Peskov, Mr. Putin's representative, has been speaking about this, and this is what he had to say. So he was talking about the postponed meeting or the cancelled meeting between Putin and Trump at the G20. He said, we expected this meeting between Putin and Trump, who could have discussed this process and outlined ways to potential dialogue on the topic of the INF Treaty. But he said if the Americans ultimately withdraw from that treaty, there's a high risk, although now they deny it, that they will deploy intermediate range missiles in Europe. And he said European territories will be in the crosshairs of our missiles if they do that. So here we are back in the glorious 1970s. It is illogical. Now, having heard, Alex, both sides of the rhetoric on this, who do you think is the most credible in terms of their position?
The Russians, because they cite historical precedent. That really is the only firm ground you have to go on in geopolitics, is what has a similar constellation of comparable or identical powers achieved in the past, what has the vector of a certain foreign policy or disposition on both sides led to. Peskov goes into great detail there, and he is, like so many of the Russian cabinet, a learned man, in his case an Oriental linguist, and of course we have others who are graduate historians. You don't see many of that on the Western side, do you? So the Western side is based on and present of menace, and the Russian side, for all its own possibly nefarious intents, at least has a solid case to plead. And I refuse to be tarred with the brush of Russian collaborationist, like so many other former intelligence, security and diplomatic people who've spoken out now, simply because I point out that the Russians are making more sense than us. It's time to challenge those making this rhetoric what ground they themselves are standing on.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Could we perhaps add to that if we just look at the simple flow of things following the collapse of the Iron Curtain, we had all those eastern states formerly under the control of Russia. They weren't allowed to become simple independent nation states. What's happened is immediately the European Union has moved in there with offers of money and help and assistance, and that has been immediately followed by bringing in weapons systems right up onto the Russians' border. So the whole of that process, if you take it step at a time, has been an expansion of the EU with its military to the Russian border.
Your thoughts, Alex?
That's exactly the case. And with the passing of George H.W. Bush this week, let's just remind ourselves, as Brian would say, that it was George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, who were at the helm of the West and NATO during the actual collapse of the overt communist Soviet Union, or as Christopher Story would point out, it was the collapse that was deliberate so that global revolutionary ideology no longer needed a territorial base because it had gone into the minds of men in the West through cultural revolution. But laying that aside for a moment, Baker and Bush, and we've done an insight episode on this with Eric Zeus talking about it. Baker and Bush went to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze and said, we will never expand an inch across not just even the German border, but across the Elbe. You know, the western zone of Germany after reunification was to be the extent of NATO militarized presence. And you know, the crucial thing is that Shevardnadze and Gorbachev were/are nefarious globalists themselves, but of another persuasion. So it's trickery against trickery, and they could never get on paper James Baker and George H.W. Bush's guarantee that the expansion would not happen.
Yeah. Well, let's have a look at the security services, and we better come in with MI6. And here we've got Alex Younger, and he's been speaking out. Of course, everything he's saying is essentially those bad and nasty Russians. So here we are, MI6 chief urges Russia, do not underestimate our capabilities. This is very arrogant stuff. There's a video clip on the Guardian site, which I encourage people to go and watch. I was fascinated that we had this man delivering what must be a crucial speech, and its impact could be very volatile in the present situation. But if you watched him, he clearly had maybe 2 or 3 words on each of his prompt cards. So he was using crib sheets. He was saying maybe 3 or 4 words, and then you could clearly see him put that sheet down. And I found this just an amazing indication that this man was either so frightened of straying off script, or he didn't actually have a script in his own head. He could only read the words on the card. So I've been a bit cheeky in this slide, suggesting that the head of MI6 couldn't properly read the big words. But if you look at the video, you'll see it for yourself. What sort of things has he come up with? Well, we face adversaries who regard themselves as being in a state of perpetual confrontation with us. One of the most now, I'm stalling on this word.
Egregious.
Thank you. Examples of this is the Skripal Hostile Act. We operationalised our values, our legal system, and our alliances. The word fascinated with me, Mike, because he could have used a far simpler word, and I'm interested as to why that word cropped up. But look at what he's saying to us. Basically, we're now at the 1984 stage of perpetual war. These people regard us as being in a state of perpetual confrontation with us. Of course, Skripal is exactly as the British government said. It was a hostile act by the Russians. There's still no evidence been produced on the world stage or the UK stage, but we're going to work with our partners to move this forth. He warns that we're entering the 4th generation of espionage. This has come about because we've had the 4th so-called industrial revolution. So we're fusing, interesting expression, Mike, fusing our traditional human skills with accelerated innovation, new partnerships, and a mindset that mobilises diversity and empowers the young. So here you've got this man, and this is a mix of professional MI6 language with much more general political and social rhetoric that's been coming out of all the 3 parties.
Well, in the full transcript of what he said, he did specifically target the fusion doctrine as a key part of what they're working on. So it was absolutely full of political language.
Political language, yes. But the moment you get into diversity and how we're going to change society, is it the role of Britain's security services to actually be deciding what Britain's future society is going to be? I don't think it is, but the fact he repeats this shows that he is under direct control of whoever produces the wider policy. Let's bring in a different image of him here. He said, he'll also set out how his agency, known formally as the Secret Intelligence Service, is preparing to strengthen ties with sister agencies in Europe amid continuing uncertainty over the possible repercussions of Brexit for security. So we're back on the subject of we've got Brexit, that's what the public are being told, but behind the scenes, everything, including the intelligence services, are being locked together into the EU system. I'm going to say, Alex, I'm finding it really hard now to understand how anybody could look at what this government is doing, what Theresa May is doing and talking about, and believe that there is a Brexit, because you only have to lift the lid of the saucepan a little bit to see that what's boiling in the pot is ever deeper integration.
Quite so, Brian, and let's look at the text of the speech on that point as well. If I just search for the word Brexit, I'll find the passage. Younger says, quote, "The implications of the Brexit debate have been set out by ministers. For our part, as SIS, we will always work with our sister agencies to strengthen our indispensable security ties in Europe," which gives the lie to the previous passage, just 2 paragraphs earlier, where he said basically that MI6 has co-opted GCHQ, and he's now talking about our Five Eyes relationship. No previous head of MI6 would ever say that, because it treads on GCHQ's toes. It's a SIGINT relationship, not a HUMINT. But so he's talking about his clique within MI6, first of all having taken over MI6 as a whole through the Russia and cyber policies, which he keeps banging on about, and I've mentioned in my recent speech at Totnes, and then expanding out to the other agencies. And I think this also shows up that prevent and contest, the MI5 strategies against so-called radicalization, are also from this clique. So he's contradicted himself, and he's basically got the knives out for his predecessor, Sir Richard Dearlove, who has his own faults, but has been quite staunch on the fact that Brexit is not a factor in security and defence, intelligence particularly, as seen properly, because it's the Anglo-Saxon alliance which we depend on. So Younger has paid lip service to that. Then he's come out and said, I belong to a different faction, one that believes in fusing with the French and Germans, whom he mentions by name later in the speech.
Yeah. And well, we'll end on this one, because here we've got some very interesting things. The UK's enemies are probing UK institutions and defences in ways that fall short of traditional warfare. To counter this, MI6 is having to innovate by fusing the information it gets from human intelligence with what it can learn from artificial intelligence and the exponential rise in technology. So if we say that our security forces are going to use information that's come from artificial intelligence, the algorithms that are going to search and provide that information, who's going to write those? Well, we can assume that those algorithms are going to be written with close cooperation with the security services themselves. So in the end, we could have a situation where we've got the security services being given a pre-scripted political agenda, and with a wave of the magic wand, we've got AI producing the very intelligence that they're seeking in the first place, which comes back into the system. I think there's something unbelievably dangerous happening here, and the minimum is that we're seeing the security services fused into democratic government, with a parenthesis around democratic. AI producing this stuff, what do you think?
Brian, it's so ironic, because artificial intelligence is the very opposite, the very antonym of human intelligence, and human intelligence is the technical name for what SIS or MI6 does. It uses brains to get among the adversaries and disrupt their plans. Again, Younger has paid lip service to this, but he gives the lie to it in what he says. If there's one organization that shouldn't be using artificial intelligence to make decisions, it is the Human Intelligence Agency, SIS. And he also waxes lyrical in his speech. He's talking to an audience of St Andreans at Scotland's oldest university, and saying, oh, how wonderful it was to be educated at St Andrews. Well, Scots such as David Scott, or indeed my father, who met my mother at St Andrews, by the way, would attest to the virtue of a real St Andrean education being the Scottish emphasis on first principles, allowing you to think for yourself and think in isolation from what is claimed about the subject you're looking at, and look at it through your own pair of eyes. That is exactly what artificial intelligence takes away, and it can be steered. He keeps banging on about cyber. This is the whole point of cyber. Computers can be steered to make people think in certain trammeled lines, and not to see certain things, or to see things that aren't there through mismatched patterns. That's the whole point of algorithms. And I asked my mother as well, who's like my father is a St Andrews graduate, what she thought of this speech, and Younger talking about the wonderful virtues of a St Andrean education. And she replied to me by pointing me to Cardinal Newman's work on the scope and nature of university education. My mother says, I read this definitive work whilst a student at St Andrews as part of my degree in English. Newman describes a university, which of course is where officers are taken from in intelligence, as a community of thinkers engaging in intellectual pursuits not for any external purpose, but as an end in itself, knowledge for its own sake. My mother continues, envisaging a broad liberal education which teaches students to think and to reason and compare and discriminate and to analyse. That's more of a quote from Cardinal Newman. And my mother ends, that is precisely what St Andrews did for me. Now, if younger is a slightly younger St Andrews graduate who's talking about having to rely on computers to get his intelligence, and also having said that NATO basically is obsolete because its Article 5 is the premise of its Article 5 is you either are in war or peace, and we're in neither these days. He says the blurring, which he blames on the Russians, which is really our own blurring. Then obviously a St Andrean education has collapsed, and he's talking hot air.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, let's stick with the subject of artificial intelligence. And, well, the International Forum on Online Courts, the cutting edge of digital reform, apparently is taking place yesterday and today. So we've got academics, legal professionals, including 200 judges, court reform experts from 21 countries attending this inaugural International Online Courts Forum. And it's taking place in London. So we've got representatives from Albania, Argentina, Australia, Azerbaijan, Canada, China, Denmark, Estonia, India, Japan, Kazakhstan, Netherlands, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Portugal, Qatar, the Republic of Ireland, Scotland, Singapore, Ukraine, and the USA, and England, Wales, of course. So they're going to focus on the development of online courts. It's being jointly hosted by HM Courts and Tribunals Service and the Society for Computers and Law. The government apparently is delivering an ambitious programme of court reform. Now, we've covered this for quite a few years, ever since Lord Leveson produced his report on court reform, I think in 2016, which aims to bring new technology and modern ways of working to the way justice is administered. So yesterday there were speeches from David Gauke, who's the Justice Secretary and the Lord Chief Justice, as well as presentations from Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunals Service. Today they are featuring debates on common issues facing policymakers, judges, technologists and lawyers, such as the use of artificial intelligence and technology platforms and obstacles. And the question in my mind, Alex, is what happens when you bring artificial intelligence into the court system? Is this a good replacement for the jury?
No, because courts of law are courts of law, or in some cases, courts of equity. We have heard mention, including by Ian Crane, quoting a recent a time when he was in court, speaking about this at AV 9.1. The better judges in English courts and Scots courts as well will say, I'm sorry, please don't expect justice or morality to come into this when they have faced with a litigant in person. They will admit these are courts of law. Well, but even law is not a book subject ultimately. When you look at the better law textbooks, they're all talking about jurisprudence, the exercise of the mind and the conscience in interpreting legislative intent, and above all, the unchanging firmness of common law. And if you go into the level of equity, which is a lot of our courts are actually law courts, not law courts at all, but equity courts, the purpose there is a fair outcome. Now, these are inherently human characteristics. And just as Younger was talking out of his rear end by saying that AI can help work out enemies' intent, because that's human brain processes and spiritual, really, in the end, the same applies to having people appear in court. You have got to use your human brain and conscience to understand even the text of the law, let alone its application in a particular case.
So, I mean, the justification that they seem to be using for this development towards AI and so on is cost. Do you think cost is part of the reason that Younger is pushing this in the intelligence services as well?
Yes, because the purpose of corporatization is to spin out of government direct control everything that makes money or everything that people want to avail themselves of. And basically, central government just remains the taxer, and the legislation in the end is written by the corporations. Adrian in the chat room has just very correctly pointed out what the other side of this is beyond the cost aspect. He says an online court is a severe attenuation of the non-verbal information flowed within a courtroom. All the non-verbal signals, body language, etc. That, I think, is the other side of why AI is being brought in, and also people are appearing less and less impertinent. Because when you get someone's aura, what signals they're giving off, you understand much more of what they're about and whether they are believable or to have sympathy with or not. And of course, AI is very much the technocratic and rule over the herd agenda, that there will be no leniency or flexibility. The letter of the law will be applied, which is a technique that one applies to cattle, to livestock keeping, not to behavior among adult civilized human beings.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Well, here we have William Black. He's a former banking regulator at the time of the S&L crisis, the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s. And he's Associate Professor of Economics and Law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Well, he was speaking to this website, USA Watchdog, and talking about Deutsche Bank. He said that Deutsche Bank poses what is called a national champion bank, and poses as what is called a national champion bank. It's the largest bank by far in Germany, but it's actually the largest criminal enterprise in Germany. He says it is insane that we allow Deutsche Bank to go from fraud to fraud to fraud. They cheat on everything else you can possibly imagine. Typically, they are getting caught, which is also not a very good sign in terms of their competence, even as thieves. Even in the United States, there's been a reluctance to crack down on Deutsche Bank. When the New York Commissioner tried to crack down, the Office for the Comptroller of the Currency, the premier banking regulator in the United States, actually sought to impede that. He disparaged the New York folks and said there really wasn't that big of a problem as such, and all of that proved to be lies. He said that Deutsche Bank is one of the leading too big to fail banks. This is going to continue until something dramatic changes. Eventually, they can cause the next crisis. And he said that eventually the German government will bail out Deutsche Bank, but that could help trigger another economic crisis when the largest bank and the third largest economy in the world is completely dysfunctional. Then the German economy is more likely to go into recession as well. That is one of the potential sources of the next recession, and you can see lots of people warning that there are signs that a serious recession is pretty likely relatively soon. Relatively could be within 2 years. Now, if you want a bit more of what this guy is talking about, this is his sort of well-known book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. Alex, just a couple of seconds. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on Deutsche Bank and his comments.
I think just very briefly, and this will make sense to people when they can get hold of my talk from AV 9.1 more, Deutsche Bank doesn't really give us stuff about what happens on the territory of Germany or whether the people there are even German or living in penury, because it is ultimately one of the survivors of the Third Reich, which in turn is the creation of, well, a marriage of the Western Anglo-Saxon deep state with the German old money. And the whole point of that continuing vector is they wanted to go global. Apparently, even further than global in some arguments, although there's scant evidence of it. But I think people know what I'm talking about. But the whole point is, at least they want to control the world's economy, and they no longer need a state, these elitists. So wherever the living is good, they will be there, and they will control the world's economy. Yes, they came out of Germany. Yes, they're German blue blood. Ultimately, but they don't really care what happens to Germany. Those living in Britain don't really care what happens to Britain. Those living in the States don't really care what happens to the States.
Okay, now let's move on to an Integrity Initiative. Second article on the UK Column website on this now. This is from David Scott this time. Integrity Initiative, Follow the Money. Please read that and spread it around social media and so on if you possibly can. That would be great. Just to comment on this, we missed this article a couple of months ago. This was on the BBC. Russia trolls spreading vaccination misinformation to create discord is the headline. It seems like a headline that you might expect to have come out of the Integrity Initiative. Alex, we haven't had a chance to sort of get your thoughts on the whole Integrity Initiative thing. What do you make of it?
With every passing day, Mike, I see more evidence that this is entirely a genuine leak. I don't believe it's a hack. I think someone has done the Western disgruntled route, thumb drive route. And I don't want to portray personal acquaintanceships, shall we say, but on the UK cluster mentioned, a lot of the people mentioned are those whom I rubbed shoulders with fairly closely in Britain's foreign policy establishment. And so the names do ring true to me. The profile that comes out are several of these people. I don't want to be too negative. I learned a lot from them, but they were rather neurotic types. and a lot of them had a haunted air about them, as if they were having others breathing down their neck. I don't think they're all evildoers. I think that they're taking orders or being suggestible by certain people above and behind them, and I think that their whole career, and some of them worked in associated bodies like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which you mentioned recently, Brian. Their whole career has been predicated upon the idea that the Soviet Union never really went away, and that the Russians are now a dead hand preventing peace and stability in Greater Europe. That's the way in which I think some of my old colleagues and acquaintances have approached this. And I think they found themselves sucked into this because they've believed the grand narrative that they are the good guys.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's just turn to BBC Media Action. A few days ago, we were pointing out that BBC Media Action, the so-called BBC charity, has been working in Ukraine, helping to create journalists, but it had had money from both the UK Foreign Office and the US State Department. We did the simple step of asking how much money they'd been paid. So this is my email from a few days ago to Caroline Sugg, who's the media, the main press contact for BBC Media Action. I didn't get any reply, so I called them today to ask if they were going to reply. The lady who took the phone call was clearly nervous and immediately said to me, "Oh, well, basically I've been told to tell you that the details you want are on our website if you look for the account information." Since I'd already visited that information, I said, well, that's not correct, is it? Because there's simply an overview of sums of money received. There's no detail of individual projects. But of course, her reply told me that she had been told what to tell me. So she was the one put in the embarrassing position. Meanwhile, more senior people in BBC Media Action clearly just do not want to tell the truth. So I'm going to say the response is silence. And what we're looking at is this charity, which is working in this very, very vital trouble spot now, training journalists using British government Foreign Office money and US State Department money, does not want to say how much money they've received, and certainly doesn't want to give more details of what they're doing. So I've suggested that the BBC, via BBC Media Action, is being tasked to set the scene in Ukraine, and that includes EU policy, because they say themselves that this is one of their roles, to help promote EU policy. So we've got the British and American government funding the training of journalists to report matters, I would say, in a way favourable to the US and UK governments. We need to ask more questions about this. This is very dangerous. It's very devious activity, and of course we've already got BBC Media Action's track record in Syria, where they admit that they were working with opponents of Assad. So not good stuff. Are the MPs going to sort it out? Well, I don't think so, because if we have a look at how British MPs are reacting to questions on EU military unification, they're also getting very squidgy, to use that expression. This is a response from Dr. Caroline Johnson, MP for Sleaford and North Hykeham, if I pronounce that correctly. So she says, "Dear Mr. C, thank you for your email. The government has always been crystal clear that defence is a national, not an EU responsibility. In no circumstances could Brussels direct deployment of UK forces without the specific agreement of the UK government. There are no proposals for an EU army on the table, and several member states, including the UK, have made it clear we would not support one." You saw that, Mike, and you picked up on the language immediately, because you've heard the same language from other directions.
Well, not the language, specific words in
Specific words,
in exactly the same order that they appear on that particular email. Somebody else has asked their MP a question and has had that specific response. So what that says to me, Brian, is that MPs have been briefed on what to say to answer these questions, and the question then is, who has briefed them?
Indeed, and I'm doing this more and more, taking a look at this lady. We go to her Twitter page. One of the things she's retweeted is that the government is donating the VAT on all sales of this year's X Factor single to children's hospices. So never mind important issues like what's happening with the UK and EU military unification. X Factor donating to those, or sorry, the government claiming to be donating to those children's hospices is more important. We are seeing more and more childish content by our MPs as they simply sideline the other issues. We'll end just very quickly on the subject of the Medicine and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. This is the organisation that has been crowing that David Noakes is now in prison as a result of his efforts to try and help people with GC-MAF. Bottom right on the screen is the headline, Crime Scene, Notorious Noakes, 10 million Guernsey GC-MAF crook imprisoned. Just have a little look at this video where they're crowing about how well they've done. We'll just see a few seconds.
Today's sentencing marks the culmination of a complex 3-year investigation by the MHRA to protect public health. Our investigation team have worked tirelessly to bring David Noakes to justice, who put public health at risk through the unlicensed sale of GC-MAF products.
GC-MAF is a product made from human blood sold by a Guernsey-based company called Immunobiotech, which is owned by David Noakes. GC-MAF has been claimed as a miracle cure for anything from cancer to HIV to severe acne. However, it has not been subjected to any clinical trials and there is no scientific basis for these claims. In January...
Now that's an interesting statement, no scientific basis for any of the claims, but of course a key part of the trial, and the judge said himself that GC-MAF was not on trial, is the people who were coming forward saying that this product has actually done things for us. But of course that's not the role of MHRA. Their role is to simply follow the letter of the law. So this ties in very nicely with how our courts run. They're not interested in helping people who've got cancer and seeing whether there's been a product that works. They are simply following the letter of the law. Interesting, the gentleman who appeared on screen in that video is a former policeman. So I think we've just put these details on screen for you. You can have a look yourself. The question I'd like to ask this gentleman is, has he ever investigated any of the deaths or disabilities arising from prescription of licensed pharmaceutical products? I wonder whether he's ever been involved in investigating the major companies for the thousands of deaths which have occurred through the use of vaccine and other pharmaceutical drugs. I think the answer will be no, Mike. Okay.
We'll leave it there.
We'll leave it there. David, Alex, thank you very much for joining us. Sorry, having a bad one here. Thanks very much for joining us. Some really important points, and we're seeing this close down of the country continue. Just end by saying thank you very much to all the people who approached me at AV 9.1 and were kind enough to make donations to the UK column. Very much appreciated. That's it for today. We'll be back at the same time
on Friday.
On Friday.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.